Welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the weekly podcast brought to you by the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. Our Curious Amalgam explores the fascinating and increasingly overlapping world of competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law. Each week, we bring you leading global experts on the most compelling issues of the day. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome to our Curious Amalgam, the podcast from the Antitrust Law section of the American Bar Association. My name's John Roberti, and today's episode is practicing antitrust law in the South. You know, in the antitrust world, many of the practitioners, many of the people in the community, our community, are located in the largest cities: Washington, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles. But the fact is, the Sherman Act applies nationwide. And there are really excellent practitioners that we run into all the time in smaller cities or jurisdictions, and they're doing great stuff. Today, we're going to talk to two practitioners who work in South Carolina, and we're going to learn from them about how they built their practice, how they run their practice now, and what it's like to be in a community that doesn't have a lot of antitrust practitioners around. I think what you're going to hear today will be very interesting. My co-host today is Kayla Odom. Hi, Kayla.
Hi, John.
Kayla, what are we doing today?
So, as you said, today we're going to speak with two well-regarded practitioners from South Carolina. And while our Curious Amalgam reaches listeners from all over the world, today I'm really excited to take a closer look at antitrust law in this particular area, the United States South. So hopefully we'll be able to learn, all of us will be able to learn a little bit more about what's going on in antitrust law in the South, and to gain a better understanding of what it's like to build an antitrust law practice in the southern states.
And what are we hoping to get out of the program?
Well, I'm hoping to learn a little bit more about particular industries or problems you might see in antitrust law in our southern states, in the courts in southern states. A lot of people who practice antitrust law, they might first think of Washington, D.C., where our federal enforcement agencies are headquartered, or you might think of California, New York, Pennsylvania, where a lot of our antitrust cases are litigated. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit more about what's going on in the cities in our southern states, and how I can use that to help my practice, where even though I may not be located in the South.
Who are our guests today?
Our guests today are Marguerite Willis and Travis Wheeler. We're going to spend some time getting to know our guests on the program today, but to give a little bit of background, Marguerite Willis is a member of the Nexsen Pruet law firm and is the co-chair of the firm's antitrust and unfair competition practice. Marguerite has served as national counsel for a number of cases covering a wide array of antitrust matters, and she is also a fellow with the American Bar Foundation. In 2018, Marguerite ran for governor in South Carolina, joining the historic surge of women running for office. Travis Wheeler, our second guest, is also a member of Nexsen Pruet. Both of our guests are located in South Carolina. Travis represents both plaintiffs and defendants in antitrust litigation and counsels on all types of antitrust issues. Travis has served in leadership roles in our very own ABA Antitrust Law section, and he is also an adjunct professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law, teaching both antitrust law and trade regulation and law and economics. Marguerite, Travis, welcome to the program.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
And thank you. Good afternoon.
I just want to say before we get started, this is Marguerite, that I am a long and proud member of the ABA Antitrust section, 40 years. I started out at the Howery Law Firm years ago in Washington, D.C., and I think I've only missed maybe 4 spring meetings in 40 years. So I want to thank everybody on this call for everything they do for the section. It's really important business.
That's excellent. Great to hear that.
So Marguerite, how was it that you got started with the section?
Well, I got started with the section because back in the day when I was at Overy, everybody basically was a member of the section because it was the way we networked across the country. As a practitioner in Washington, D.C. at that time, we had big cases. Howard had big cases all across the United States and internationally. And so the section was a way to meet at least once a year in connection with the spring meeting to meet your colleagues from across, at that time, across the country. So that's how I got started. And y'all may know John Briggs, who I worked with closely at Overy, who was a section chair. Roxanne Henry was also a section chair, was one of my partners. And more currently, Brian Henry is one of our clients, has been one of our clients here. So we have a long, I personally and Travis as well have a long and very cordial and collegial relationship with the section.
And how was it that you ended up in South Carolina?
Well, I married the mayor of Florence, South Carolina 20 years ago. So I moved from Overy and moved to Florence, South Carolina. And at that time, I was representing Monsanto in a very big private antitrust lawsuit against DuPont over the Roundup Ready herbicide business. And Nexsen Pruet happened to be my local counsel in that case. So once I married Frank and moved down here, it was sort of a natural, I sometimes call it my second arranged marriage. I came here and joined Nexsen Pruet as a partner 20 years ago. So that's how I got back to my native state of South Carolina. I've been here 20 years. And so I came from Washington, from the big city practice down to South Carolina.
We'll get back to the arranged marriage thing because that's probably something we carry on later in the program. But Travis, how about you? How did you end up where you are?
Well, I went to college. I started out at the Naval Academy, and I'm not very good at the military school thing, and ended up at a liberal arts college in Spartanburg, and stuck around the Carolinas for law school. I did go up and practice with Arnold & Porter after a clerkship, and but really kind of wanted to come back to the Carolinas. And the first Columbia firm I worked with, it was 15 years ago. I remember in an interview they said, "Well, there's not a lot of antitrust work in South Carolina, but whatever it is, we do it." And I thought, okay, that's positive. And in the 2 years I was there, I wrote one white paper that dealt with kind of an antitrust question. And then I got an email from a headhunter asking if I'd be interested in resuming my antitrust career in Columbia. And I knew it was some sort of trick or spam, so I deleted it. And then there was a call maybe 6 weeks later, and it turned out that there was this, across the street, they were building up an antitrust practice. And so that was a pretty quick jump over in 2007 and been here ever since.
And of course, I was the one building up the antitrust practice.
Yeah.
How did both of you get into antitrust law? Was this something that you'd always wanted to do, or did you sort of stumble into it?
Well, I definitely stumbled into it. When I clerked for two federal judges and went to practice law in Charlotte, North Carolina in, I guess, 1976, long time ago, right? Anyway, I was hired by a firm that had a dispute with Duke Power Company, and their client, my new firm's client, was Gulf Oil Corporation. It involved an international uranium cartel. I hadn't heard of antitrust law. I didn't know anything about it. I'd gone to law school in Florida, hadn't studied it. Spent a fabulous, fascinating year flying around the country. I went down to the uranium mine in Gramps, New Mexico. I flew on a Learjet to an appellate court to stop something for the client. And when that case was resolved, I was given a stack of cases, including the dentist who was left out of the phone book. I'm not kidding. And so I said to the guy who ran the litigation practice at this firm, I said, well, where's the next big case for me? Where's another case like that international uranium cartel case? He said, well, we don't get those very much. So I thought about that for a minute. I picked up the phone and called the general counsel of then Gulf Oil. I figured I'd met him. I remembered him. He'd remember me. Well, there weren't that many women practicing law back then, and particularly not in the antitrust area. So I just said, I'm willing to move anywhere in the world to work for you and to work on related cases. And the general counsel of Gulf Oil Corporation put me at the Howry and Simon in 1978. That's how I got into the antitrust law business.
Yeah, and this is Travis. I got into it because of evidence. The beginning of my fall year in law school, I was in a 4-credit evidence class, and I decided by Wednesday that I either needed to get a new class or I was going to stop going and just hope I learned it on my own. And a friend of mine said, well, there's another 4-credit class, Antitrust. You like law and econ. I was doing a law and econ independent study note thing. So I dropped evidence and signed up for, it was the only year that Terry Calvani ever taught at Duke, signed up for his antitrust class. And, he was one of my favorite professors I've ever had. And that was one of my favorite classes I've ever had. And within, 3 weeks of that class, I knew that's what I wanted to do.
Wow, that's great just to hear. I mean, how you got into it, Marguerite, from the dentist who got left out the phone book to, these bigger cases, and Travis from law school classes. It's certainly interesting to think about how I got into it. It was more of a stumble for me, but it's great to hear how it started for you. And I guess I kind of want to talk about what it compares like. What your practice is like now compared to when it started. So what would you say the lay of the land was when you started, and how has that changed over the years to where it is now?
Well, let me lead off with that because I'm senior, let's use that word, to Travis, at least in age and practice. Well, first of all, Kayla, I'd have to say it clearly has changed because there are many more women involved in the practice of antitrust today than when I started. There were very few women who were practicing antitrust law back in the late 70s. I was the first female partner at the old Howry firm. So that dates me, but also tells you how few women were coming up through the ranks. So there's that. I think as well, I think the practice has spread geographically, what we'll be talking about more on in this podcast, because as John indicated, historically and still today, most of the antitrust practitioners were in New York or in Washington, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, and so that has changed. I think there is more practice around. But in the years that I've been practicing, what I've seen too is I think over time, more and less government regulation. We're in a sort of a lull right now, but we've had periods of huge government regulation, hence lots of activity and less private lawsuits. And then you see this private lawsuits coming into the breach when there's less of the government regulation. So there's that as well. And plus, let's just face it, when I started practicing, we were still using books with case notes, with case numbers. I mean, all of this, including, I'll say, if John Briggs ever listened to this, he's the reason that I actually use email. Because one day at Howard, he walked into my office and said, if you don't start using email instead of sending me these memos in the mail, I'm not going to work with you anymore. So he forced me to use email. So literally, it is all the technology and I think the broader geographic reach of the laws.
Yeah, Kayla, books are these things. They have a cover on them and they have pages in them. And what we used to do is we used to go and there were what we call shepherd's volumes. So you would get a case and there would be a book, and you'd have to look on in the book and find all the different citations. And you go to a different book and open that book to the case and read it. It was, Kayla, this was, you wouldn't understand. Travis, how about you? How did how it changed?
We learned about these historic methods back in my day as well. So
yeah, I wasn't sure if you'd seen photographs or something. Travis, how about you? How has it changed in the last 15, 20 years?
I think from my perspective, at least how it has changed our practice in a kind of a micro level. I think, these cases were, the antitrust cases are big. They're long and they're larger than really our firm had been used to. And so you would get on a case, would work on it for a few years. And I think it was 2007 to 2010, we were kind of looking at what's the next case that, may involve someone in the South, someone in the Carolinas. And I think now that the practice has evolved and we've done enough things that we now have kind of a stable of clients and firm clients and really more of a, I think we're just more, there's more permanent. We're not really kind of jumping from, one case to another. It did take a few years to get rolling, but I think it's built.
Well, Travis and I talk a lot about the fact that when I first came here 20 years ago, people literally didn't know that you did not hyphenate antitrust. Matter of fact, I call it the secret handshake. If anybody ever sends you something that hyphenates the word antitrust, they're not an antitrust lawyer. And I tell that to folks when I speak about the antitrust laws. Everybody laughs, but it's true. And when I first came here, one of the things that I had to do to build a practice was to go out and educate people. I spoke a lot. What are the antitrust laws? What do they mean for you? And in a famous episode, when my brand new husband proudly asked me to come speak to the Rotary Club in Florence, South Carolina, which I did, about the antitrust laws. And I got up and I gave my standard presentation I would give to a board of directors or a group of senior management about the antitrust laws and the consequences of violating them, et cetera. Literally, the people in the room at the Rotary Club in Florence, South Carolina were falling asleep in their soup. They were bored to tears. The only time they sort of raised their eyebrows was when I mentioned that it might be a crime and you might go to jail. That was it. And I realized after that disastrous presentation that I had to retool what I said and make it more user-friendly. And from that, and Travis has used this presentation too, I still use it today, I created a presentation called The Antitrust Laws, 10 things you can say about them at a cocktail party. And that is my standard presentation even today, not if we were doing antitrust training, but still about things that are accessible to folks when you're trying to educate them not only to the laws, but to be able to recognize when they might have a problem. And
yeah,
so
Marguerite,
we've spent a lot of time trying to tell folks.
The first training that I did down here probably 8 or 9 years ago, and it was a local company, and they said, take as long as you want, but we want everything stem to stern. And we settled on 4 hours, and we got through everything. And I realized about 2/3 of the way through that everyone in the room was daydreaming about hurting me. And the last one that I've done, I tried to remodel it, use another one of our partners, and kind of tried to copy the general form of the International Cartel Workshop, which is one of my favorite, ABA events. I mean, it's a perfect thing. And that was by far the most well-received training I've ever done.
So until people realize that they possibly have a problem, they're not going to come to you with the question. And so we did a lot of spade work early on, particularly in that area. We also, I just might add, we weren't afraid and still aren't afraid to take the big case, the difficult case, because some of the matters that have come to us have been ones that are big and difficult. As a matter of fact, we right now have a big antitrust case against Duke, the same company that started out my antitrust career. I'm battling them again. But we've been trying to be brave about it, and we've had a supportive atmosphere here with that. And by being brave and sort of stepping forward, particularly in a small arena, you get some prominence, and hopefully you have a good result. And we've been blessed in that regard to have good results for our clients.
So a couple of things you said just now really, really stick with me. One is, and I think this is a universal truth, is if you are explaining something to a client or business person or a potential client, you've got to speak their language. And that applies to the training, and then that really feeds into the second point. Where I have run into some really excellent antitrust practitioners who are not working in the biggest cities, and I think what those folks do, and it's a real competitive advantage for them, is one, they speak to their local clients in words that they understand. They understand their business. They understand their objectives. They're close to them. So they do a very good job for their clients. And secondly, they know their courts really well. And they do a really good job of speaking to judges and juries in their local jurisdictions, again, in words that they understand. And I don't necessarily mean to say those are small words. They're just words that help them to convey these concepts. And I think that's actually, we talk about how it's hard to be out of the jurisdiction, but I think that's a real advantage. If Marguerite, Travis, if there's a case in Columbia, South Carolina, I want you on my side. I don't want to be on the other side of you.
Well, there are relatively few antitrust cases filed in South Carolina, but when they are, the judges will tend to, if it's a closed question, they'll tend to go with the folks they know, who they know will be back, and who wouldn't, for that one case, skew any particular argument. Because if you're a repeat practitioner in the jurisdiction, you have to remember that you'll be before the judge again and again and again. And in a situation where there are relatively few matters, judges do recognize you as someone who is a reliable authority in the area. And that is a big advantage. But you're right about that, John. And Travis and I were talking before we joined this call about a particular case that we had a number of years ago involving a client, a good client of this firm, who actually didn't know the firm had any antitrust lawyers because they'd never had an antitrust problem. And they were stocked with a big one, and they hired some of our good friends now from Skadden. And then they found out that the local folks, us, also did antitrust, so they hired us too. And I think that, of course, Skadden did its usual superb job. And I think they were a little skeptical of us until we went to a big meeting of defense counsel. I walked in the room, everybody knew me because I'd been at Howry. So suddenly I had some what shall I say, ballast with the folks. But I think in that case, what the local client got from us was the absolute commitment from the heart that they had to be saved. They were good people. We knew them personally. They're good clients of this firm. We had a long-term investment in not only their past conduct, but in their future conduct. And to this day, we're still great friends with the folks over in that law department, even though they've never had another antitrust problem. It's a matter of knowing them and caring for them in a local sense.
Speaking of antitrust problems, can you tell us a little bit about, what kinds of antitrust issues are coming up in the courts these days in the South? And what's the most common type of issue you might see?
The ones I filed.
or maybe what industries are having problems right now?
Yeah.
I don't know that I've seen any real differentiation between the types of antitrust issues, in the South as opposed to anywhere else. We've worked on a lot of cases that didn't really involve a lot of conduct in the South, and some that did. And I think for the most part, they're pretty similar. If it's a cartel matter, it usually, cartels usually start when things aren't going well. The individuals involved usually have some burden that they are shouldering. They feel a little bit guilty or dirty about it. I haven't seen that a distinction there. In terms of when people pick up the phone, what do you get? I think a lot of the 30-minute calls, at least, and then maybe this is somewhat local. I think pretty much businesses in South Carolina, they wouldn't know, they don't know Legion, but they know that at some point in the relatively recent past, there has been some change that allows them more ability to kind of manage downstream pricing. But they don't know the details. And so you get a lot of calls about that, that maybe, we're doing this, or, we've heard, one of our buddies, that kind of thing. So I think there, that's the one area where I think there might be a difference and a little bit less knowledge of the details of the law.
Yeah, when I first came here, I was surprised to know that most of the work that was done, and I'm going to call it in the competition area, had to do with mergers, local mergers, and folks knew a little bit about merger law. And then there were a lot of phone calls just about price discrimination. People thought they couldn't charge different prices to different folks. They knew that much, and they would sometimes call about that, but that was about it. And so, as I said, we stepped out and took some cases. After the Monsanto DuPont case was resolved, we filed a case on behalf of all the timber growers, owners of South Carolina, the Timber Association, against International Paper. We filed a monopsony case. I mean, most people can't even spell that down here, right? And we went over and developed that case in federal court here. Principally because the Timber Association called around and nobody else could understand how that could possibly, be a case. And all of our cases, I have to say, probably Travis and I ought to write a book, but they all have something like the person who meets you. In that case, there was a guy who met us at a rest stop on the highway with some secret document that he left in the men's room. I couldn't go. Somebody else went and retrieved it. So we have a lot of that kind of fun intrigue in our practice from time to time. But we've stepped out, and I like to think that we have upped the level of practice in this part of the world. Because understand, in South Carolina, we're one of those states that we, back in the late 1800s or so, early 1900s, we passed an antitrust law here, state law, to fill the gap in the interstate coverage of the federal antitrust laws, as many states did, but we sort of let it lapse. So our state antitrust law isn't even viewed by the courts. It's been construed as only applying to intrastate commerce, except for Travis, who buys and sells chickens in his backyard. Literally, there's not much intrastate commerce left. So we have a dead antitrust law here in South Carolina.
In this changing world, I would not be at all surprised if we see more and more people working in doing excellent antitrust work in cities that we don't see as often, because I think it's just going to be easier for people to get involved. It's easier, with remote contact and things like that, with the level of sophistication. I think we could see a little bit of the work spreading out a little geographically. Last question, and we want to shift gears. And I'll start with you, Travis. One question for each of you. Travis, I see you're a law professor. How, if at all, does that help you with your business? Why did you decide to do that? And how does that all play into what you're doing? I know it's fun, but was there a business purpose in doing that?
So it has helped with business. One way is, and the only antitrust professor in the state, and have been for 10 years. So I do get referrals from, former students who are now, who are now practicing. But I also think it helps. Marguerite is kind of referred to being at Howery and coming to not as long at Arnold & Porter, but I think it does help, and it just gives a little bit of a little bit of credentials, and I think that does help in dealing with the sorts of lawyers that we usually deal with in these cases. The other thing it does is that it keeps all of that in my head, and it helps because I am much better at picking up a phone, a cold call from a client, and answering questions, not having to say, and let me look at that and get back to you. It keeps all of that antitrust law and trade regulation just in my head year round.
All right, and Marguerite, last question goes to you before we pivot and ask a little bit more on your background. Marguerite, if I want to win a case in Columbia, South Carolina, other than hiring you, what do I need to do? What are the keys to success in litigation when you're litigating a complicated issue in a smaller town?
Well, I think that obviously hiring me is number one, John. But but I think what you need in a complicated case, you need a terrific testifying expert. We've had great success with folks we've worked with repeatedly who are able to convince the judge in certain circumstances. And that's important because often the judge in a complicated case is listening to the evidence differently than the jury is. I'm also a big believer in doing jury research, and we've had great success in that regard too. So I think getting good jury consultants and getting a great testifying expert, and that is the person who really has to be able to speak the language of the jury. So a local expert, if you can find one, is ideal, particularly in an antitrust case, because, people want to talk about regression models and all this stuff that nobody understands. And you've got to have someone who can cut through that and get to the jurors on the level where they can understand that something bad happened.
All right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. And Marguerite, I'm going to stay with you. Tell us something interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know if we only knew you professionally.
Well, I was Miss Teenage Greenville back in the day. So, and that actually has recently played into a case where we're in a multi-county case. And one of the reasons they decided it wasn't so bad to go to Greenville was because I grew up there and was Miss Teenage Greenville.
Now, did you have a particular talent that you had to show in order to win Miss Teenage Greenville?
Yes, I sang, and I also took a test, an academic test. And when the questions came at the end, when the finalists were up there, two of them got asked about things like stay-at-home moms and a recipe for spaghetti. And I got asked, I'll never forget it, who I thought was the most important author of the 20th century. I thought, where's my question about making spaghetti? So anyway. Yeah, so I managed to cough up, I think, Joseph Conrad or something. I just studied that somewhere. I don't know what I said, but I won. And then I went off to Dallas to compete in the Miss Teenage America pageant. So there you have it.
Travis, tough act to follow. Tell us something interesting about yourself that we wouldn't know if we only knew you professionally.
I can do that.
Marguerite's already leaked the chickens. I guess I did write a book in college. I took a novel writing class, and they would publish one book every year or two, and I got selected, so I got to have a published novel that people have ever read.
What was your novel about?
It was semi-autobiographical, mostly autobiographical, about time at the Naval Academy. Wrote it at Wofford.
Wow. If you're ever interested in writing, a book about podcasters that are changing the world, give Kayla a call.
Will do.
And I'm very tempted to ask you what's your best recipe for spaghetti, Travis, but unfortunately, I think we have to go to our last segment that we call The Curious Hat.
And now it's time for The Curious Hat.
Now, in times when we were all together, I would have an actual hat. In the actual hat, I would have actual questions, and you would pull a question out of the hat, and I would ask you that question. Since we are doing this remotely, I am wearing the hat, and what I have instead is the questions that are numbered from 1 to 25, and I'm going to ask you to choose a number, and I will read the question associated with that number. Travis, you go first. Choose a number between 1 and 25.
6.
Okay. 6. Okay. If you couldn't be a lawyer, what would you be?
Nothing is off limits.
Nothing is off the table.
Nothing is off limits.
Like 12-year-old self or my 46-year-old self.
Why don't we start with your 46-year-old self?
Yeah. I think I would be
an handy race car driver.
I'd say I would say 12-year-old self would be a race car driver. I think 46-year-old self would be an English professor.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought of writing a novel about a race car driving English professor?
Not yet. Give me something to think about this evening.
I'll give that some thought. Okay, Marguerite, let's go to you. Can you choose a number between 1 and 25?
20.
20. Okay. Marguerite, who is someone that you look up to or that you greatly admire?
Well, there are a number of people, but right now Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we're all praying will get through and recover again from her current illness. And in particular, also my grandmother, who is gone, who was Miss Marguerite. And from her, I learned the importance of being independent, particularly financially independent. It's a lesson I've carried with me throughout my life, and one that I regularly speak on to women across the state and across this region about the idea of having your own money and controlling your own power that way. So Justice Ginsburg and my grandmother, Miss Marguerite.
Wonderful.
Those are two good ones. But let me ask you this question, Marguerite. Who is someone who looks up to you or greatly admires you and you can't say Travis?
I'm not sure I would say Travis. I would say someone who greatly admires me and looks up to me is a young man who Travis and I both represented in a very difficult non-antitrust case against a military academy. And he had a very hard time. We were not successful in court in that case, but we changed his life in meaningful ways in getting him the kind of help he needed. And just recently, he was able, when I say able, to finish school and to get married, and he's just had a child, and he sent me pictures, and he calls me every Mother's Day to thank me for what we did for him.
And you know what? I think that's why a lot of us are lawyers, to have experiences like that.
Yes.
Travis, Marguerite, thank you for joining us. And to those who are listening, thank you once again, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Our Curious Amalgam, a competition, consumer protection, data protection, and privacy law podcast. It is produced and shared around the globe by ABA's Antitrust Law Section. The opinions expressed by the participants in this podcast are their own and do not necessarily represent their employer or other organizations. If you like what you heard or would like to become a member of the American Bar Association, please check out what the Antitrust section has to offer at ambar.org/antitrust. You can learn more about our podcast at ourcuriousamalgam.com. If you have comments, suggestions, or podcast ideas, please reach out to us at podcast@ourcuriousamalgam.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.